The next phase of the debate was P3 proponents would say, well, yeah, we acknowledge that governments can actually borrow money more cheaply than P3 operators can. And so there's a bit of a cost disadvantage for P3 proponents on the financing side, but it's more than made up because these projects involve significant transfer of risk from the government to P3 operators. And they talked about the risk of project cost overruns, the risk of future inflation, all kinds of risks that P3 operators argue proponents were absorbing and taking off the hands of government, and the value of that additional risk that was assumed by the P3 operator and taken off the hands of government more than made up for the cost difference. There's been really interesting and extensive work done on the issue of risk transfer in P3 projects in Britain, which is where P3s have been active as a way of delivering infrastructure projects for a very long time. A well-known radical organization called the Institution of Chartered Accountants in Britain has done a massive study of risk transfer, and it comes to the conclusion that there is substantially less risk that's actually being transferred in P3 projects than the project proponents claim. The cost of transferring that risk is substantially higher than it would be if the risk were just kept by the public agency and spread over all public projects. And interestingly, this study also concludes that there's a whole new set of risks that are created in P3s that don't exist in conventional government financing. And to simplify what it is they've said, the new risk that's created is what I might call walk-away risk. And what that means is that what that relates to is the fact that in a P3 is different from any kind of conventional project. If I'm operating any kind of conventional project and I hire somebody to build it, and that project proponent just runs it for a while and then decides they're not making enough money at it and just walks away. Well, the private operator that built the project and walked away from it just writes off their investment, and I just write off my investment. In the case of a hospital, for example, the private operator may have a walk-away right, but the government doesn't. The government still has to operate the hospital. We've still got a publicly funded healthcare system. So what that means is that the most important downside risk in hospital never gets transferred. And in fact, it becomes greater than it was without the P3. Because in a conventional project, there's nobody out there that you're worried about walking away and handing you back the hospital and stinging you with whatever's left over. In conventional funding, the government runs the project. There's nobody out there, as I said, who has the potential to stick the government with walk-away risk, because there isn't any. But in a private project, there is. And unless anybody thinks that this is abstract, let me just cite a couple of examples that might make you think a little bit differently. In the province of Nova Scotia, they developed a number of school buildings, a number of schools through P3s. And the P3 operator built these schools according to the P3 proposal, and the schools were in rural areas where they didn't have access to municipal water supplies. The water was supplied through wells. And in two of the schools that the government privatized, the P3 operator drilled wells into water that contained arsenic. And needless to say, when the public health authorities discovered that the drinking water in these schools was laced with arsenic, they got upset and they issued orders to the P3 operator of the schools to clean up. And the P3 operator looked at what their legal liability was to kids who'd been drinking the water, and the cost of replacing the wells that with contaminated water with clean water, and they decided that that was going to wipe out their project. So they walked away and handed the schools back to the Nova Scotia government. So guess what? The Nova Scotia government ended up getting stuck with school buildings whose drinking water was contaminated. They ended up getting stuck with the cost of fixing those buildings up so that they could be used. There's an example of walkaway risk imposing substantial additional cost on the government that originally sponsored the project.